Welcome to Hamer Reviews. My name is Christopher Hamer. Today we're going to be looking at the production from my solar panels here in London in the UK for the month of March, and I'm going to be discussing the performance of the north and south arrays, total amount produced, the impact that our SolarEdge Home Battery is having, and just more generally the impact of the weather, which played a huge role this month. And in fact, that's where we should start off. The month of March here in the UK was very wet, very cloudy, and this was especially true towards the beginning of the month, which I can attest to through the performance of the solar panels here. Essentially, the first 2 weeks of the month saw very little production. I think at the very start of the month we had a couple of days of all right sunshine, and then it just went downhill from there. And when I say downhill, I mean we were producing the best part of around 5 kilowatts of power per day for over a week. This was purely due to the horrendous weather. We had huge amounts of rainfall, huge amounts of heavy cloud. And obviously it doesn't matter where your solar panels are, if they're under heavy cloud, they're not going to be producing a huge amount of power. This also led to the first month where we've really heavily deviated from what SolarEdge's design tool predicted we would produce and what we actually produced. The prediction for the month was that we would have produced 473 kilowatt hours of power by the end of it. The reality, due to the bad weather, was that we fell 130 kilowatt hours short and only actually produced 342. That is way off from where I'd want it to be. I've generally been seeing around a 10% margin for error on the design tool versus my actual production, but this month was just way off. It didn't account for the terrible weather we'd have, and I can't say I'm surprised. I don't blame SolarEdge, but it was just that bad. The days where we had good production, which was more towards the end of the month, we had a couple of days where we produced over 20 kilowatt hours of power, around 20, 21, 22, which is great, but it just couldn't offset the really bad weather where, you know, we're producing 3 kilowatt hours on the 8th, then 7 kilowatt hours on the 7th, we're producing 6 on the 6th, 5 on the 5th, that's nice and matching up, and then 5 on the 4th as well, and 4.2 on the 3rd. You really can't make those numbers up. Once you have those days where you have really bad production, you're just not going to see a huge amount. And I think that also heavily impacted the performance between the south and north sides. So if we look at the north side, the pure production figure was around 13 kilowatt hours per panel, whereas on the south it was much closer to 24 kilowatt hours per panel. Now what this means is that in actual fact, the north side was able to produce around 55–60% of what the south side could. I actually, if the weather would have been better, would have expected for those figures to be closer to 50–50 at that time. I don't think the north side would have done as well, but when you have such heavy cloud cover, it just means that the panels are all producing pretty much the same thing due to the diffuse sunlight, and that's where you end up. As ever, the actual battery that we have installed, the SolarEdge Home Battery, played a large role as well in my energy usage. So of the power that we did produce, so of that 342, 172 of it went through the battery, so that's around 66%. That means that without having that battery in place, we would have ended up exporting more, but we also would have ended up having to buy a lot more because we wouldn't have been able to store that power. So the batteries continue to pay dividends, and to be frank, it's going to end up being a better choice from an economic perspective than I expected, because I didn't think that we'd have quite so much power run through it, so that's really good. Now, as I did in February, I want to take a look at the best day that we had, and that was the 27th of March. Obviously, as we get towards the end of the month, longer daylight hours, better sunlight. Now, that actually wasn't a day of wall-to-wall sunshine. The actual performance of the panels wasn't great in the afternoon. I'm guessing we had some cloud cover. However, the figures do show that the system was starting to produce 50 watt hours by 6:45 in the morning, so that's around half an hour sooner than in February, on the 8th of February specifically, and we were actually still able to produce power up until 6:45 in the evening, at which point we were still producing over 340 watt hours, and even past 7 o'clock around 7:15, I think the system switched off, where we produced 11.3 watt hours. Now, those figures aren't very high, but it did point to the fact that the system's starting to start up earlier and finish later as the days get longer, which obviously has a huge impact. The other thing is in February, our peak output was 3 kilowatts. That's the peak figure that I saw on the 8th of February, where it was the only day where we actually had like sunshine at midday. And that was quite low on an 8 kilowatt array. Now in March, specifically on the 27th, we did have some peak output on the 27th at 1 p.m, specifically 5 kilowatts. So huge improvement. We're starting to see the sun is higher up. It's able to hit the north and south sides at the same time. We're starting to see way better production as a result. Another thing that's worth mentioning briefly in March was that we managed to export 86 kilowatt hours. That's purely on those days where we did have some half decent sunshine. Obviously, now we're able to produce much more energy due to the longer days. We're able to export more. So our export from February was around 30 or 40 kilowatt hours, and now we're exporting 86 kilowatt hours, starting to see those big jumps that I talked about in my February video. And our consumption was also incredibly high. Our consumption was around 357 kilowatt hours. Don't have a hot tub or anything hooked up yet. However, because it was so cold, we were running our boiler much longer. We were running lights much longer because it was so dark, despite it being March. And yeah, our usage was way up. So actually, if our usage had been more similar to February, we would have been able to use much more of our own power. We would have been, if our consumption had been the same as February, we would have been closer to 90% self-produced. But because our consumption was so much higher, we actually only produced 72% of our energy, and we had to import 28%, over 100 kilowatt hours. Very disappointing, but one of those things. Now, make sure that you subscribe, because March did see things starting to get a lot better. Our consumption figure was much better as well. Equally, if you have any questions about the system, or indeed the production from this month, pop them in the comment section below. And if you haven't already, do subscribe, as it really does help me out. Thank you very much for watching. I hope I see you again next time. Goodbye.